You don't need it for the room, but you need it for the internet. Make yourself at home.
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, here. Flipping on. Thank you all for coming. I wasn't sure you'd find the room. So here's the reason why we moved. This evening is the day school 6th grade drama club presentation of The Little Mermaid. So if any of you are here to watch adorable little kids sing and dance as under the sea, you're in the wrong room. Okay, that room is up the hallway. And there are about 1,000 people in that room because it's the kids and all their moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas, and they're just felling. They're full of pride and joy. And when they get finished, they're going to come screaming down the hallway. And I was concerned that we wouldn't be able to learn because they would all... So anyway, we moved in here because it's much cozier and it's far away from the Little Mermaid. Unless Professor Holo would like to sing us a rendition of Under the Sea.
I'd love to. You don't want me to.
That would be kind of joyful, right? Under the sea, under the sea. Darling, it's better down where it's wetter. Take it from me. Good evening. So this is VBS College of Jewish Studies, where you have a chance to learn Judaism on a university level without the sororities, football teams, and no quizzes or term papers. And tonight we're delighted to welcome Professor Holo, who I will introduce in just a moment. Our theme this year has been the debates that shape Judaism. And next week we will continue our conversation, Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, probably again in this room. And our guest will be Rabbi Tal Sessler, who currently serves as the rabbi of the Sephardic Temple on Wilshire Boulevard and is a professor of Jewish thought, a teacher of Jewish thought at the AJR, the Academy of Jewish Religion here in Los Angeles. And Dr. Sessler will be talking about the debate between Hasidim and Misnagdim. Anyone here a Litvak? Anyone here? So you know what I'm talking about. Anyone here a Chassid? Then you have to sit on opposite sides of the room because they hated each other. There's two very different visions of what Judaism is and how one conducts oneself as a Jew. And that debate between Litvaks and Hasidim, between Misnagdim and Hasidim, between mystics and rationalists, which will start tonight, is a very, very important central debate in the early modern period of Judaism. And that'll be our conversation next week. The week after that, our guest will be Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, who will bring us into modernity with a conversation between the two great fathers of Zionism, Theodor Herzl and Ahad Ha'am. Two very different visions of what the Jewish state was supposed to be. And then following that, Rabbi Farkas and I will do two very different visions of American Judaism, represented by Abraham Joshua Heschel and Mordechai M. Kaplan. And then we'll finish at the end of the month with the most important debate that ever shaped the spiritual life of Jews, which is more authentically Jewish, Hamantashen or Latkes. And that will be our conversation for the month of February. I hope you'll come back every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Louise is our hostess along with Billy, and we have wonderful cookies for everyone. This coming week, just to give you a sense of what's going on here in the synagogue world, we are in the middle of the month, we're at the end of the month of January, right? This coming week, it's a very quiet Friday. Shabbos will have Torah study and a bar mitzvah in the morning. And Sunday, of course, is the traditional Super Bowl, or as we like to call it, the Shul-Per Bowl. If anyone would like to come and watch the game, we're doing a thing here at the Shul. It'll cost you a few dollars a donation to the scholarship fund, and you can watch the game on a 50-foot screen epis with rabbinical commentary. Right? Watch this, you know. So that'll be Sunday. We're having a little fun doing that. And then we'll continue our learning Torah study Shabbos morning, Wednesday nights, College of Jewish Studies. There's other things going on, and you can pick up all the flyers and see all the wonderful things that are happening. In the world, as you know, lots of things are happening, but tonight we're going to leave all that behind, take a look deeply into the life of the Jewish people. So I know it's a little uncomfortable in these chairs, but if you possibly can stand up. Can you stand up? Is it really impossible? And now squeeze and turn around and say hello to the folks sitting next to you and behind you and wish them good evening. The barber and the Jew in the flood. I love this. Thank you. People came. I'm really delighted.
You know what? It's totally unsafe for me to go take a quick leak.
No, you can. No, please.
I know exactly.
Yeah.
Skip that. No.
Good. Don't sit down because we're about to. We're about to. So put your arms around your new friends and draw them close. This is a very social shul. Very good. Very good. Very good. 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 And join us in a prayer for learning together, and then a prayer for peace. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al 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 kol Yisrael. Please be seated. As the professor is going to tell us in a moment, during the Jewish Middle Ages and the Christian Middle Ages and the Muslim Middle Ages for that matter, life was a confrontation between multiple ways of finding truth. And the two principal ways were the rationalists, who said truth is available to the human mind through the work of our reason, and the traditionalists, who said truth is a gift of God through the gift of revelation. And that confrontation between reason and revelation, where do I go to find the answer? Hi, welcome back, welcome on. Where do I find the answers to my life's problems? Do I reason out the answer to the question, or do I look in Scripture for an answer to the question? And what's the relationship between what I learned through reason and what I learned through revelation? And then there's a third way, which is called mysticism, which we'll take up in just a moment, which in some ways sort of undermined the whole conversation, went around the whole conversation. But the question had to do with where you find truth. And this became the most important project of thought in the Middle Ages. How do you find truth? It's the project that launches philosophy and Philo, that rises in Maimonides in the Christian world in Aquinas, and then at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of modernity, it begins to get settled with people like Spinoza and Descartes. How do I find truth? How do I find truth? And this becomes one of the great questions. Tonight, our guide in this conversation is a dear friend. Professor Joshua Holo is the academic leader of Hebrew Union College, which is downtown, the Reformed Seminary and an institution of Jewish learning. He's also a professor of history at the college. He also grew up in this neighborhood. He's taught with us before, so he's a landsman. He's a Ben Bayit, and we're really delighted to have you. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
May I stand?
Yes, stand, sit, lie down, whatever you'd like.
Thank you. Thank you. More, yeah, good. I like that. I'm not shy. It's okay. There we go. So
professors don't get enough of that,
that's
so
right,
it's really very good.
Before I start, I am indeed a Ben Bayit. In fact, I am a Ben of this Bayit, not this shul alone, but in fact this room, because I was a bar mitzvah here at Valley Beth Shalom in 1984. The Olympic torch passed by on Ventura Boulevard on the eve of my bar mitzvah. And this room is very dear to me. In fact, I don't live in Encino anymore. I've lived in Chicago, I've lived in Colorado, I've lived abroad, but now I live in Woodland Hills, and every now and then I sneak into Valley Beth Shalom for a nostalgic moment. And when I sneak into Valley Beth Shalom, I don't go to the sanctuary, to the big hall, where I was in fact bar mitzvahed, and I come right here to this room, if the door is open, because this was where we had the Alta Kaker Minyan. Do we still have the Alta Kaker Minyan here?
Same
The same Alta Kaker. Now, back in the day, if you were a bar bat mitzvah, you had to spend the year leading up to your bar bat mitzvah laying tefillin with the altakakers who would make sure that you did it right. And they would say, hey, come over here, Pisher. And they'd put on your tefillin and get it right. And you'd go up, and on Monday, Thursday, you'd get an aliyah, or you'd lead the Amidah. And is this still the rule?
Oh, yeah.
Ah, I am so happy that it's still the rule, because that was the formative experience of my bar mitzvah. It wasn't the first aliyah, in the big sanctuary. It wasn't the gifts. It wasn't the party. It was coming here and experiencing lived Judaism with they were all men. It was already egalitarian, but they happened to be all men. They probably had nothing better to do. Women are actually productive people, so maybe that. And the men were coming to shul, and they shaped my experience. So thank you for having me back, and it's a pleasure to be in this room with you and to teach coincidentally here. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is how do we understand the difference between mysticism and, as Rabbi Feinstein pointed out, rationalism. These are the two poles that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to tell you a story, two stories that will help give you a sense of what we're talking about. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit more to build on the rabbi's introductory words about why it was so important for actual Jews' lives. So to illustrate the difference between mysticism and rationalism, we'll start with the story about mysticism. Mysticism can be understood like a barber shop. In the barber shop, you get your hair cut facing the mirror, and the barber is behind you cutting your hair. And so there was a person in the barber chair facing the mirror, and there was the barber behind him cutting his hair. But when one looks in the mirror at the barber shop, one often sees not just oneself, but also the barber behind you and everything behind the barber. And you see the scene, in this case, on the street. And so you can see what's going on outside as you're getting your hair cut. And our hero, the client, was in his barber chair, looking at the mirror, just checking out the view of the street through the glass panes of the barber shop onto the sidewalk. And lo and behold, out of nowhere comes the procession along the sidewalk of the king self, walking with his entourage and his crown on his head. And the guy in the barber shop yanks at the barber. And he says, look, the king passed by. You just missed him. You didn't turn around fast enough. And the barber says, I see him all the time. The nimshal, the interpretation, the meaning of this story is the following. Who is the king? God. As is often the case, God is likened to a king of flesh and blood, only because this is an image that we can relate to. We speak of God as the King of Kings, etc. The person in the chair, our hero, this is the schlepper. This is you and me, just people living our lives who have the capacity to be inspired even by being in the proximity of God, who yearn for that connection. And when we catch a glimpse, we get excited, we care, we want to pursue, we want to get up and follow, we want to connect with God. The barber is the prophet. The barber is the person who connects with God by vocation and has a connection to God that us schleppers simply don't get. The prophet does not need to look in the mirror to see a reverse image behind himself or herself of God. The prophet has the red phone straight to God. And the mirror The mirror is Torah. The mirror is the speculum, the lens, the window, the mediator between us and God. We can only see God, us schleppers, we can only see God through Torah, because Torah was given to us for that purpose, among other things. The prophet actually writes Scripture. We read Scripture, and through that we connect to God. And from this we learn what Jewish mysticism is to us, because mysticism in general has two components. First of all, what's the root of mysticism? What word in English is the same root as the root of mysticism, the word mystic? Mystery. One component of mystery is the full embrace of the ineffability of the Holy One. What does ineffability mean? Yes, inexpressible, unsayable, unspeakable, incommunicable. And so that's mysterious. So one component of mysticism is the embrace of the mystery of God. And the other component of mysticism is the yearning for intimacy with God. So mysticism is the embrace of mystery, and despite the mystery, despite the incommunicability, despite the difficulty of wrapping our minds around it, we yearn for it. That is the mystic, intimately. Those things about mysticism apply to all religions who have mystical traditions. Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, you name it, of certain types of Buddhists, and certainly Jews as well. But our story about the barber, the relationship between God, the Torah, the Jewish people, the people of Israel, and the prophet, is that unique setup that we have with God. This is Jewish mysticism in a story. What is Jewish rationalism? Jewish rationalism is a story you've all heard. We'll put a Jew in the flood, but it could be anybody, because you've probably heard the story anyway. The Jew is in a flood, and he's treading water as the water is rising, and his city is falling under the water, and he prays to God, God, save me. But the current is taking him down the river, not too fast, but taking him inexorably down the river, which is overflowing its banks. And he's getting closer to the bank, and there's a woman on the side, and the woman has a stick. And she reaches out as best she can. She reaches out. She says, take the stick. And he says, no, I prayed to God. God will come. And he flows down further. And sure enough, a fisherman in a boat is coming by looking for people to save because he's not fishing. And he rows up and he says, hop in, hop in. And the man says, no, no, no. I believe in God. God has come to save me. And then, finally, a helicopter comes down with the medevac unit and all the guys in purple vests, and comes down, and they lower down a rope, and it's dangling right in front of him, and he's treading water. He's getting tired. It's been a while. And he says, no, no, it's okay. Go save somebody else. I believe in God. But he gets too tired, and sure enough, he drowns. And he goes to heaven. He's a good guy. And he says, God, I prayed to you. I trusted in you, and you abandoned me. And God says, no, what did you want? I sent you a woman I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter. So the story here is, you are given by God the tools. It's in your grasp. More than that, if we take the story to where it really goes with rationalism, it's not just in your realm that there are such a thing as a boat, there's such a thing as a helicopter, all of which were created by human ingenuity. It's that it's in your mind. You're born with it. By virtue of your humanity, you are endowed by God with the rational capacity. This is, in fact, the gift of humanity in your human shell. So use it. Use that gift of rationality for everything, including for knowing God. Now, these two things feel, I think, appropriately differently, and I hope the stories have illustrated to you how different they are. Now, I'd like to take a step back and share with you why these things mattered so much. And I would like to establish an analogy. Usually, when I'm teaching, I'm a medieval historian, when I'm teaching my students at the Hebrew Union College, I tell them that we're going to talk about the conflict between philosophy and mysticism. Not unlike we heard laid out by the rabbi and by me. But you may have also heard we use the word rationalism. We're not going to use the word philosophy tonight at all. We're not even going to use the word rationalism anymore. We're going to use the word science. It's actually about science versus mysticism. And the reason I want to use the word science is to help you understand why this was such a big deal. And so we're going to draw an analogy. It's an imperfect analogy, and I beg your forgiveness off the top, because analogies between the modern world and the ancient world or the medieval world are inevitably imperfect. There's no way around it. But bear with me. Give me a little slack here. Today, we are familiar with the tension in our own society between those who believe in global warming and those who don't, right? We know this is a real disagreement in society. The reason I want to tell you that is because that case today determines, think about it for a moment, what it determines. Depending on how you land on that debate, if you believe in a religious spirit of understanding the Bible to guide your life in America in a certain very rigid way, you're going to treat global warming as some kind of scientific conspiracy. And vice versa, if you believe that the science is real and describing the reality, you're going to be very antagonistic to people who disagree. If you believe that global warming is real, it's going to affect a lot of your choices. It's going to affect whom you vote for, which will in turn affect your taxes. It may actually affect your sex life, depending on how many kids you want, because you may feel that you shouldn't be having a lot of kids. It will affect what you do when you go to the supermarket. It will affect what you choose to eat. That orientation, what we'll call the scientific orientation, it's an oversimplification again, I understand that, please bear with me. That orientation filters down into your life in a million ways. It's very consequential to very quotidian. If, by contrast, you believe that you have a divine mandate that makes you steward of the world as laid out in Genesis in relation to Adam, and that you can do whatever you want, and that you should be consuming, and should be whatever, a different worldview, I don't want to caricature, you're going to make different choices. Let us appreciate in the Middle Ages that if you believed in science, what we call philosophy or rationalism or Aristotelianism or Maimonideanism, but I'm calling science, you believed that the world was capable of being understood by thinking it through something akin to what we call the scientific method. That you observe, you question, and you can predict, etc. Now, this goes way back. The rabbi was right. It goes back to Philo, the turn of the Common Era. It goes back to Aristotle, the 4th century BCE, etc. But in Judaism, it comes out in the Middle Ages in its full form. Now, it affects your choices. If you are a rationalist or science-oriented medieval Jew, it affects how you read Torah. And Torah is the mirror in the barber shop. You do not encounter God except through Torah. You do not catch a glimpse of God except through the mirror. And your relationship with God, your relationship, and my relationship, by virtue of us calling ourselves Jews, with God, is everything. Because we believe we have a specific, documented, real covenant with God that has conditions and consequences and governs our lives. It governs what you buy at the supermarket, how you pay your taxes, who your leaders are, maybe how many children you're going to have. It has influence in ways that are very comparable to the way we encounter science today. Big and small every day. If, however, you are a mystic, you are going to read the same Torah very differently. And it will cause you also to change your diet, even though they're both kosher. They're both religious, what we would call today Orthodox, but there was no such term back then, really committed religious Jews. Their lives would look very different. They would make different choices about prayer, which occupied a lot of their time. They would choose to study different books. They would understand their mutual responsibilities to one another differently. The stakes for this debate were not the stakes of the great Maimonides and the great Nachmanides or any other number of rationalist, science-minded versus mystics we could name, although it was certainly about that. But this was about the kishkas of all the Jews on the street, and they cared even if they didn't actually understand it. Because most Jews probably didn't read Maimonides, or at least not his philosophical work. But the stakes were too high. The communities shaped themselves in relation to this, as you're going to hear in a couple of weeks, between the Misnagdim and the Hasidim. This had political, economic ramifications. So, if nothing else, I want you to understand the barber versus the Jew in the flood, the mystic versus the rationalist. But even more than that, I want you to understand that our forebears invested this dispute with profound sense of their own destiny in real terms, not just in highfalutin, abstract, academic terms. So, that's the background. And now it's going to get a little bit drier because we're going to have to read these texts a little bit so you can walk away with a nugget, a little bit of understanding of one or two of the components of science versus mysticism in the Middle Ages so that you can have this understanding under your belt and experience our own Jewish history in a way that you can really hold on to and maybe even talk about over Shabbos dinner. So I'm going to set up one set of examples that shows the absolute conflict between mysticism and rationalism. And then I'm going to try to show you a harmonization, a way of understanding rationalism or science in relation to mysticism that isn't quite so antagonistic. Because I believe that there is a message here for us, Jews today, and now I am not getting political, but I'm going to speak about a political reality. We, like America around us, have been speaking to each other, frankly, beneath the dignity of our civilization. We have not been living up to the demands of our covenant to God and to each other, to share our disagreements about the things we care about for the sake of heaven. Maybe you here are all friendly with one another, and I hope so, but I think you know what I'm talking about. There has been some rotten tomato throwing across the aisle within the Jewish community about topics of great concern, about Israel, about the presidency, about economics. It's all fair game, don't get me wrong. It's the opposite. I'm saying, yes, let's disagree, but let's take things we care about and let's make sure that they elevate us rather than that we go to the lowest common denominator. And let us imagine the most consequential debate in the Middle Ages as really, really heartfelt and passionate and potentially corrosive, and sometimes it was corrosive. Sometimes they went to the depths. But that there is also the capacity to think about ways holistically because it's worth it, because we share a destiny and we owe each other that. And so I hope this will be a model, just a thought experiment for the elevation of our people today, so that you should walk away with this learning in medieval Jewish history as a way to enrich your Jewish and human experience today. So, we'll start. When should I end? In 15 minutes?
No, but hey, this is a tough crowd, and we learn.
Good. Good, because I'm going to need help reading this because I can't read anything without my glasses, and I forgot them. So, are these? I don't know, man. So, we're going to start off with the classic disagreement. One of the classic disagreements between science, or the science-minded, and mysticism. And we will start with, usually, I figure this is a learned crowd under one of our great learned rabbis in this country. And I have a suspicion that you may have come across the Kabbalah. So I was going to do a number, a juke, and give you something that wasn't Kabbalah, because I want to shake it up a bit. So we're not going to talk about the Sfirot and the emanations from God, and all of which is beautiful and poetic and important, and I know you will have other opportunities. We're going to talk about how high is the arch of the foot of God, because you should know. Right? The rabbi said so. And so, I want to point something out to you. This is really important. I want to remind you that both the science side and the mystical side will call on Torah. These are all faithful Jews here we're talking about. So we're talking about people who rely on Torah no matter what. But how they use Torah will show us how radically different they are. So, I am going to ask someone who can actually read, unlike me, the left-hand column under where it says examples at odds. The left top column from the Shiur Koma. Shiur Koma is the title of the book that we give it, and it means the measurement of God's height. Literal height, like how tall is God? So, will someone read? Thank you.
Rabbi Ishmael said, I saw the King of the Kings of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, as he was sitting on an exalted throne, and his soldiers were standing before him to the right and to the left. In Isaiah 6:1. The angel, the prince of the presence, whose name is Metatron, Rabbi Ishmael...
So, forgive me, I'm going to interrupt you there. And there was the grammar is a bit off because I cut and paste, so I apologize. What's the image? Can someone recap the image? Yeah?
An exalted king sitting on his throne.
Okay. What's the architectural image here? What would you call this room? Where God is? Yeah, throne room or a palace. And you can kind of imagine an HBO series where all the soldiers down like in a row on one side and then the soldiers on the other. By the way, I think it's Isaiah 6:2, not 6:1, but forgive me, I'm not sure. So first things first, I want to establish the image of God as a king with all the accoutrement of kingship. Not just an abstract notion, but a highly detailed visual of the throne room. Now, let's just pause for a minute to illustrate how relevant Bible is here. Let's go to the right column, and I just want to read Isaiah to remind us how biblically inspired this image is. So can you continue reading the right-hand column?
Okay, Isaiah 6:2-3. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his legs. And with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. His presence fills all the earth.
Okay, and we say this in the Amidah, in Kedusha, right? And the Seraphim Lumatam, they're facing one another. And so you have the seraphs, the angels, for lack of a better word, these heavenly, these heavenly beings attending on God. Yes.
We also, it seems to me, mistranslate Adonai Tsevaot as the Lord of hosts. It's actually the Lord of armies.
Except insofar as the notion of an army is intrinsically, it's embedded in the word, is the idea of multitudes, which is hosts. The word tzava means an array of people, and a host is an array of people. So it's not a mistranslation; it's a purposely poeticized translation, which could slightly divested of its martial element, but only slightly.
But doesn't that reflect back to the left-hand side?
Yeah, it does, which is martial. I agree. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a mistranslation.
Yeah, okay.
All right, I just want to establish this the biblical bona fides of this image of God. You know, do you guys remember in Hebrew school when our teachers, mine right around the bit here, Dr. Singer, would, I love it, son. Really? Oh, he taught me Rashi. Oh, wow. כן. נכון. Wow. Ooh, I need a minute. Wow. He was my Rashi teacher right here.
He was Jewish history.
Right there. He's a. That's right. That's right. No, I.
It was at last year's Hebrew High dinner.
Oh wow.
At the dinner.
Oh my God.
Passed away a few months later.
You know, this is a moment where, you know, as you can tell, I'm a medieval Jewish historian, and I'm going to shock you with something. There aren't that many jobs out there for medieval Jewish historians. And I thought, going to graduate school, I thought that I would have to take the first decent academic job that I would find. In fact, my first opportunity was in Norman, Oklahoma. And I didn't get the job, but I was like, that's great. I'll take Norman, Oklahoma, Oxford, Mississippi, you name it. I'll be thrilled because there were so few jobs. But to land in my own hometown and to have these moments is one of the great gratifications of my life, and you've just shared that with me. Thank you. So, where was I? Shir Koma. Thank you. The Seraphim and the Chayot HaKodesh mitnasim lumat Seraphim. And they say, holy, holy, holy. And they proclaim, and it's straight out of an HBO special, right? Now it gets, so that's pretty physical. That's pretty visual. Oh, I know what I was doing with Dr. Singer weaning me off of the notion of God, bearded old guy in the clouds with a white beard, right? We were all weaned off of that image. We were taught that that is too simplistic. It's frankly inappropriate. An image of God that doesn't really get us closer to God, and it's not really quote-unquote Jewish or what have you. Right? Were we not all taught this, more or less? Apparently we were all taught by Dr. Singer, so I think so. In other words, this is contradicting that teaching. This is teaching us that for well over 1,000 years, it's been perfectly kosher, thank you very much, to talk about God sitting majestically with, an implied beard and certainly a crown. There's a million stories in Midrash that are like this. This is in fact a trope. It's so common. But now it gets really wild and really not just physical in ways that we were taught not to understand God, but actually reveling in the hardcore physicality of God, so much so that God can be measured. So, bring us home with the second half of the column, the left column.
Rabbi Ishmael says, "What is the measure of the body of the Holy One, blessed be He, who lives and sits for all eternity? The soles of His feet fill the entire universe, as Scripture states. The heavens are my seat, the earth my footstool. The height of His soles is 50,000 parasangs, 175,000.
Yeah, just for the record, I did the math, okay? So I got a parasang is 3.5 miles. It's a Persian measure of distance. It's a standard rabbinic tool for measuring. We know that the rabbis had weights and measures like we do, and this was one of them. So, what's going on here? I thought that we all agreed, that we were taught that God is A, not a man, thank you very much. God doesn't have a sex. But God certainly doesn't have a measure. In fact, if we were ever to talk about the size of God, what would we in our world today normally understand? How would we express the size of God? Sorry? Infinite, everywhere. Which is just a way of saying there's no measure. It's just another way of saying. And here it's the exact opposite. It's saying not only can I measure God, and granted, God is big, sure, because God's God. But actually, God is a specific height. It starts at the soles of His feet. Granted, okay, He's really big. But what would you expect? But God is still measurable at all. And so what we have here is one of the most radical articulations, committed religious expressions of the embodiedness, the corporeality, the physicality of God. Now, before we go on to the opposite, I want to acknowledge that today, when we're being intellectually honest, we today, my colleagues, cannot actually tell you whether or not the author of this or the authors of this tract, the Shir Koma, we don't actually know, we can't quite suss out the degree to which the author literally believed this or metaphorically believed it. But there is reason to believe that they were attached to the physicality of God in a way that they would not have been satisfied with just a metaphor. And this certainly indicates that much. Everyone with me thus far? Any questions, objections, heresy accusations?
So, I guess this text here is an image built on the image in Isaiah, right?
Partly.
So far, so good. Where does the number 50,000 come from?
Okay, so the number 50,000, I don't know actually specifically where it comes from, except to say that the word myriad in English is often linked, I think, to 60,000. Is it 60,000 or 30,000? 60? The word of myriad. In other words, there are fixed numbers that are intended to convey a lot in various traditions, and that number changes. Does anyone know what a myriad is exactly? I think it's 30 or 60,000. I don't know if we. Yes, but I just want so the number is a way of saying really big. But it's not from Torah.
But it's not a specific, like somebody went out and theoretically measured. It's just another way to say a lot.
Yes, certainly, probably, yes. I mean, there was no tape measure here. Yeah, certainly, probably, yeah. That's as good as I get. I see a hand, yes.
If we believe today that God is infinite or the universe, why is this relevant to us? Because it's measuring God.
So it's relevant to you because if you want to decide that your theology is in fact the theology we were raised in, that God is infinite, you should at least know that that is not from Sinai. That is not a fixed, clear, obvious thing. You may believe it, and you may have a million good reasons to believe it, and you may be able to cite your sources. Great. But if you're going to do that, you also need to know that there is another way of understanding God, which is native to our tradition, is kosher, and is part of the tapestry of Judaism. And moreover, it is incumbent upon us to recognize the stakes that I spoke about before, that this is not just an abstract thing, that people cared about it because it governed their lives, and that we should respect and care about our fellow Jews who had opposite renditions of theology and nevertheless share our destiny. This is an important message, precisely because you disagree.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
I'll ask you a little bit differently, with permission
Of course.
from the professor. How do you know this stuff? How do you know anything? That's really the question, right? How do you know anything? Has any of you ever seen a molecule? How do you know they exist? In what way does a molecule exist if none of us have ever had direct experience of a molecule, right? So look at the beginning of the source again. It says, Rabbi Ishmael said, I saw God. This belongs to a species of religious life in which you know something because you have direct experience of it. There are people who have direct religious experiences. Now, then they have to describe those experiences. This is what you said about metaphor. When I have to describe an experience, it's very hard to describe certain experiences. I can more or less tell you what I had for dinner tonight. I have a very hard time telling you how I feel about my wife. Right? Dinner, I can describe. You know, Thursday's chicken, you know. But a long relationship with the person I love, it's very difficult. So I use various kinds of symbolic and metaphorical languages. But underneath it, you understand that what I'm describing is an experience. And an emotion, something that happened to me. Rabbi Ishmael, it happened to him. He had an experience of God and then was trying to describe it, okay? As opposed to what we're seeing in just a moment, how do I know the molecule's there? I don't. But a molecule is a mental construct. It's a rational theory that helps me explain the events of my life, the events of my interaction with physical matter, for example. That's a rational construct. It's a very different way of knowing something as a rational construct than knowing something through direct personal experience. Agreed? So the question is, all right, so, you know, how do I know anything? And how do I know the things that matter most to me? Right? How do I know the things that matter? My daughter goes on a date. When she was dating before she met her husband, and she would go on something called J-Date, which is a gift of God, and she would show me the guy's profile. And I would say, yes, he's perfect. I mean, look, he went to this university, he has this job, he's religious, he's kind, he's look at the picture with his mother, I mean, you know. And she'd say, Abba, he may be perfect on paper, that's rational, but I met him. No chemistry. That's experience. You see? So when it comes to something that's really important to you, do you insist on experience or do you trust your rational conclusions? And how do we vote? How do we spend money? How do we make life choices? How do you arrive at something as important as faith? Through experience or through rational conclusion? Okay? So what we have here, what the professor's shown us here, is Shir Koma is a whole bunch of guys' mystical experiences, right? They had these experiences of God. I don't know how many of you are of my generation, but people used to go have these experiences all the time, sometimes chemically induced, but they'd have experiences. They'd come back and try to describe to you what they saw, right? Okay, now we're about to jump from that to a rational thing. So is God more like the guy my daughter met at Starbucks, an experience? Or is God more like the mathematics I learned in elementary school or the existence of molecules? You see? And is that reasonable?
That is. I would only add the following.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, please, of course. I would only add the following. We must attribute to these religious experiences of Rabbi Ishmael and his colleagues in the Shir Koma the same literalism that we attribute to the story of your daughter. In other words, the rabbi does not then dismiss his daughter's experience as fantasy. He actually believes she went to Starbucks with somebody. That's what's happening here. That's an important distinction because that's harder, that's a bigger leap of the imagination for us to really credit. But it's true. As far as Rabbi Ishmael is concerned, his encounter with God, that experiential knowing, is as real as your daughter's knowing of the dud, of the guy in. Okay, sorry. Someone in the peanut gallery called him a dud. I don't know. But we don't know. So, did you want to say something before? We'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get there. So now, as the rabbi exactly said, we're going to move to the polar opposite position. Explicitly so. And in this case, I am relying on familiar territory for many of you, unlike the Shir Koma, which is probably you've never read. Maimonides, we know. Maimonides is the great rationalist, the great scientist. He was, in fact, a doctor. He really was a scientist of the Jewish Middle Ages and among the greatest of all the Middle Ages of any religion. Really one of the great refined minds. He tried to harmonize in some ways, which we'll get to, but he was not a harmonizer in many ways. He was actually a combatant. And so we're going to read a little bit of Maimonides that speaks precisely to the issue raised by Shir Koma. So I'd like to ask for a volunteer to read. It goes on to the back of the top of the next page, but it starts on the bottom right of the table. Can someone volunteer for me? Mishnah Torah. Bottom left. Thank you. Bottom left, please. You just volunteered. Yep.
Mishnah Torah, foundation of the Torah, where it is written in the Torah, and there was under his feet, Exodus 24:10, written with the finger of God, Exodus 31:18. The hand of the Lord, Exodus 9:3. The eyes of the Lord, Deuteronomy 11:12. The ears of the Lord, Numbers 11:18. And more like expressions.
Period. Question mark. First of all, two things going on here. What do all of these citations have in common? Two things. They can you yell that out loud, please? They mention body parts of God. So that one thing they have in common is they all refer to specific body parts of God, which feels a lot like the Shir Koma. And the other thing is that they're all from Bible, Torah, just like Shir Koma. So we're setting up here a diametric opposition about the same sacred literature. And the first thing Maimonides does is says, okay, it's true. Torah talks about the hand of God, the feet of God. That's true. I can't deny it. It's in the text. But how are we to understand those expressions? Are we to take a tape measure and actually measure the distance of the sole of the feet of God because it says their feet and we know God's really big? Well, that's one solution, but continue to Maimonides' solution.
All such terminology
Yes.
is in accordance with the conception of people, human beings who cannot recognize aught but corporeal things, and the words of the Torah is like human speech, but they are all attributes.
Stop there for one moment. Can someone summarize what he's saying in these two sentences or two yes?
We are projecting our own image onto God.
We're projecting our own image onto God. Why?
That's how we understand it.
Right. Our own capacity for understanding is circumscribed by our own experience. We are corporeal beings, even though we have the capacity for abstraction. We nevertheless live in a physical world. And in this case, so God is a being, not a thing, but a being. And we are beings, and we identify because we have the spark of God in us. It's natural that we should use the language of our body to describe God. But it's really just a reflection of the impoverished state of our own human limitations. We can only think in the language that we're given, and that's a physical language. It's a physical idiom. Continue, please.
For example, it is said, if I whet my glittering sword, Deuteronomy 32:41, does he have a sword or does he slay with a sword? It is a metaphor, so it is all metaphorical.
Okay. What's a metaphor? It's something that stands for something else. What's a simile? It's a metaphor with the word like in the middle. It's the same thing, except it's worded differently. Just because I use one thing to stand for another thing, it doesn't mean that they are the same. They're similar, or they can relate to one another. So just because I refer to God as having feet, it doesn't mean God actually has feet. And it certainly doesn't mean you can measure 175,000 miles up to the top of God's soul. It's one of the strongest arguments for us not to use he as a pronoun for God, because if you understand God as something far greater than any of this, God has no sex, God has no body, there's no word for God except again, metaphorical words, the best we got. God, or Adonai, Hashem. Hashem is a perfect example of us avoiding any word because we have no sufficient word. Okay, so you see that this is a diametrically opposed position from the Shir Kama. Everyone with me that far? Now, I want to go back before the hour's up to remind us of the stakes. The stakes were very high. Maimonides, today, we think of as the greatest mind of the Middle Ages, and we admire him. And there's not a sector of the Jewish world today that treats him with anything other than admiration and respect. Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Hasidic, you name it. Everybody reads and treats Rambam very seriously. But in his lifetime, he was a lightning rod of controversy, and he was despised by huge swaths of the Jewish population in such a great degree that there was an accusation, not 100% proven, but made nonetheless, that the Jews, the anti-Maimonidean Jews of France, went to the Christian authorities, the Dominican monks, and effectively bought them off to burn the books of Maimonides. How much of the depths is that? Jews using Christians to burn fellow Jews' books. Just so we put into proper context the stakes. This is not a bunch of guys in rooms with fancy libraries with their tushes in the chairs and the nose in their books. Although it's also that this is the fabric of Jewish being and the expression of our covenant with God, and therefore our reason for existing at all. That is the stakes, nothing less. We must appreciate that if we are also to learn the lessons of history. And so now, can I have two I'll wrap up with the harmonization. You asked, is there any middle ground? Is there any way to... Now,
Again?
please.
So I want to make the professor's point even stronger. Why did they burn Maimonides' books? Listen to what he said. Every time the Torah says the hand of God, the finger of God, the face of God, the foot of God, he says it's a metaphor because we know logically God can't have a body, right? Logically God can't have a body. Why? Because if you have a body, that has a limit. In other words, there's a place which is your body, and then there's a place which is not body. And that would mean that there's a place where God isn't in the universe, and that's logically inconsistent. And therefore, all the expressions of bodily corporeality, which means body stuff, of God, has to be a metaphor. Now, that sounds pretty simple, right? Even kids, grade school kids know that, right? Oh, yeah? How about the following? Vayidaber Adonai o Moshe lemor. The verse that occurs the most times, repeated the most times in the Bible is, God spoke, and this is what he said. But wait a minute. If God doesn't have a hand, or a foot, or a throat, or a mouth, what do you mean God spoke? That means God communicated, but is communicated without speaking? What kind of communication is that? You see the problem? Wait, it gets worse. If it's a metaphor, and the Torah is full of metaphors, what else a metaphor? Torah says you should not eat certain animals. Is that to be taken literally or metaphorically? What if I say, Torah says don't eat pigs. No, what it really means is don't eat like a pig. Don't eat a pig-like fashion. Don't eat foods that start with P.
Or it could mean, as Jesus says, don't worry so much about what comes into your mouth, worry about what comes out of your mouth.
You see, what you've done now is you've
you're in a bind.
opened a door to all sorts of interpretation. And there were rabbis, there were leaders of the community who were terribly afraid of that process. You see the process? That process of finding metaphors in the Bible. And that's what got them scared. Because they were worried that once you start playing that game, there could be no end to that game. I mean, you see how that works? There could be no end to the game of finding metaphors where the Bible tries to affirm truths. And who gets to decide? And so this stuff becomes really, really difficult. And ultimately, ultimately the question is, if you don't need the Bible to tell you how to live your life, you could figure it out rationally. You can throw away the whole religion and just become philosophers. I mean, you see, so it becomes a very difficult. It's a very serious and very, very subversive kind of exercise, and that's why the rabbis were so afraid. That's why certain rabbis, not all, he had his fans. I don't, you probably knew that. That's why, but certain rabbis became very frightened of this, as other rabbis were frightened of the mysticism of Shir Koma. Does that make sense?
To put even a finer point on it, you could read Maimonides as making a liar out of Torah. And if you don't believe that metaphor is really, if you think metaphor is fudging, then anything short of the literal truth is a fudge and a lie. I mean, it gets emotionally, there's even other layers. I just want to point out, put a finer.
Right.
But are we all on the same proverbial page? Yes.
It seems like there's an air of authoritarianism through this.
Yes.
You put that as one of the stakes, right? The authoritarianism that says, you have to trust the literal word of Torah or something like that, and there's no
Yeah,
interpretation.
you're calling it authoritarianism. We might call it authority. If, as the rabbi said, you can derive truth using your brain, then what is the value of revealed truth from God? And so you have to decide not just authoritarianistically, am I your interpreter, your rabbi, but much higher up, can each of us make our own truth? Or is there a specific truth delivered by God to Moses on Mount Sinai in Torah? And so authority is very much the question, among the questions that the rabbi articulated. Yes?
I think we all know what a pig is, but we don't know what the God is. That's why we can't use the metaphor. I think the rabbi is just scared to lose their business.
Yeah, that's you could read. She said that you know what a pig is, so you can't really take that metaphorically. But none of us really knows exactly what God is, so it's understandable why you would take that metaphorically. And the insistence on taking it literally is really just rabbis keeping their jobs. That they now you could read it that way, but I have to say there's a problem in the way you're reading it, which is you're forgetting to attribute to the Jews of the day the sincerity and the depth of their faith. Remember, they all believed in Torah from Sinai, including Maimonides. Nobody questioned that. So there's a profundity here which we're not so used to. And I think we have to take a leap of the imagination sometimes, even in our own history. So, yes?
Could it be that the metaphor is just describing the attributes of God in a way that could be understood at the time?
Yeah,
That's
what Maimonides
That's his
is
point.
saying.
That's his point.
That's Maimonides.
Yeah,
that's
these are
exactly-
attributes that have been, the metaphors are attributes.
or tools for understanding God's actions. So they could be attributes. It could also just be a figure of speech. And that has the figure of speech not having any attribute at all, except to move the story along, to give you a sense of what God's intentions were. So God spoke to Moses. It has nothing to do with speaking. It just has to do with conveying.
Yeah, let's get to Sefer Yetzirah. We're never
Okay.
going to get a break. Hang on just a second. We're going to try to get to the next text, and then we're going to take a break and come back. We have lots of time to discuss this with the professor.
So what we're going to read now is another text that most of us have not encountered, interpreted by the predecessor of Maimonides and the leading rationalist prior to him, named Saadia Gaon, he was born in Egypt, and his career took place in the environs of Baghdad in the great Academy of Surah in the 10th century, late 9th, early 10th century. So we're going to read the text and the commentary. The text is a mystical text, and the commentator is a rationalist. And in this, we're going to find an opportunity to think outside of the binaries imposed upon us by the admittedly very difficult problems posed to us in the previous example. So, who would like to read the original, thank you, the Sefer Yetzirah? It's an unknown date from the late period of the rabbis or the early Middle Ages, we don't know.
Sefer Yetzirah. 10 are the numbers, as are the Sefirot, and 22 the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. These are the foundation of all things. Of these letters, 3 are mothers, 7 are double, and 12 are simple.
Okay. We're not going to go into the double, mother, simple. It's a highly technical book where they have charts and letters, and I myself do not claim to be an expert. But can you interpret that paragraph for us, please?
I think instead of using, well, now they're going into words and letters.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Yes.
Which are, so you're getting, actually you're almost getting away from metaphor, except for using the 3 as mothers and.
Yeah, okay, so those are metaphorical in their generativeness.
So, but they're, and you're getting away from the human body.
Okay, so we're certainly not talking about the human body. We're talking about numbers and letters. And so I want you all to go back to 10th grade and remember when you took chemistry or bio and think about recombinant DNA and RNA, the stuff of biological creation in the universe, certainly on this planet. Do you guys remember that DNA and RNA, they have these letters? They're just symbols. They're letters that we attach to the various nodes of the strings. I've already forgotten. But there's only like 5 or 6 letters. 4. There's only 4. All right. So of those 4, you can recombine them infinitely and create infinite varieties of life, right? You can create DNA, and the combinations are infinite. So you imagine numbers and the 24 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and they are also like any language. You don't need that many letters to be able to recombine them as much as you want to create as many sounds and as many words, and therefore as many ideas as you want. The reason I choose the metaphor of DNA and its recombinant power is because it is generative. It is how we create life itself. And so too, God's creation of the universe, which is embedded in words, is expressed here as the recombinant generative power of language. Now, when you say a word, what is it? What is the word? When I say dog, we have energy, we have reverberations, but we don't have a thing. It's not physical. And yet, with a gust of air and the vibration of my chords, I have evoked in your minds a 4-legged creature, mammal, probably friendly, furry, etc., etc., etc. I have generated the idea of dog, even though there's a different dog in a different set. Each one of us has a different individual dog in our minds. 3 letters, 1 syllable, nothing to show for it, and yet there is something to show for it in your mind. This is the imagined mysticism of this source. It's incredibly eloquent and simple and elegant and powerful and resonant. Yes?
Yeah. My response to what you said is that when you say a word, dog, what my mind does is map it against a set of personal experiences.
Yes.
And out of that comes maybe a 4-legged animal.
Right.
It could have a color. It could have a tail or not, things like that. But it's my personal experiences against which I map your vocal cords.
Yes.
Now, if I try to do that with God,
right,
the best I can do is my experiences, which are composed of going to Cheder or Hebrew school, listening to you, listening to Rabbi Feinstein. But it's a personal interpretation. It's not a belief initially. It's an interpretation against
with
experience.
You, and it's a very sophisticated read. I very much appreciate what you're saying. I don't disagree at all. I just want to point out that the canvas of God in Genesis 1 is no thing, no body, no baggage. It is the generative power of God. And this is how they express it and they try to capture it, because we can relate to the generative power of something immaterial in a kind of materialized way. And that's what psychologically, psychotheologically, the Sefer Yetzirah is eliciting. So I'm not asking to prevail upon your belief. I'm asking you to stretch your historical imagination to understand the belief of the author. So, we now are going to go to Saadia Gaon, one of the great scholars of all of Jewish history, 10th century Baghdad. And he is going to try to illustrate a rational interpretation of the creative force of the greatest mystery of all of Torah, which is how God can create something out of nothing, and how the Sefer Yetzirah is attempting to describe that. Please.
Sa'adia Gaon, 10th century. Sefer Yetzirah. The Sefer Yetzirah ascribes the origin of the Creator's creation to 32 things, the 10 numbers, and 22 letters. He does not say, however, that they're abstract and isolated. He only says that God has created the air and has established the 32 things in it. The numbers, according to him, traverse the air, which is composed of distinct particles. When the air current follows these direct and inflected lines, it produces figures.
Stop right there. So I'm going to walk us through this rather than ask, forgive me, just because I sense it's getting late. The best image I can come up with is The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. You remember? The invisible man, when he's naked, is invisible. But when he wears something, whatever he wears takes the contours of his body and he becomes visible. And so they had a very sophisticated, this goes back to a Muslim movement called the Kalam, which understood particles and airs that we call atoms today, etc., not unlike the molecules which we heard of from the rabbi. And what we have here is the energy of the resonant divine utterance itself is abstract or disembodied, but when it is surrounded by the atoms of the air make way for this thing, and the contours of the thing, or it's not a thing, the contours of the creative force, the letters and the numbers, are rendered discernible in the shape that the air takes around it. Like the clothes on the invisible man make the man visible by virtue of forcing the contours around him. Everyone with me?
Mm-hmm. They explained that the sage brought a powerful and brilliant fire down upon the mountain, as it is said, because the Eternal descended upon it in fire. Exodus 19:18.
A biblical quote.
Then he surrounded it with a black cloud, and the mountain burned with fire unto the midst of heaven, with darkness, clouds, and thick darkness. Deuteronomy 4:11.
And so we have the smoke surrounding the energy of God, and the smoke creating the contours to render visibility. Is everyone with me? So here's what we have. We have one of the greatest rationalists, the most influential rationalist up until Maimonides, creating a physical picture, a scientific picture of the way matter interacts with what we will call, for lack of a better term, energy, and renders the energy perceptible. This is the height of science in the Middle Ages, to describe the most radical expression of the conundrum of God's creative power. And in it you see a capacity of the imagination and the intellect to wed our two gifts from God. Our seichel, our mind, the spark of the divine in our human capacity, and Torah, the gift from God that gives us our purpose and locates our destiny both with God and with each other. Thank you.
Let me summarize for a second, then we're going to take a break, have a coffee, and come back and figure all this out. I want you to imagine 3 Jews in the Middle Ages, middle-aged Jews, okay? Midlife crisis. Most Jews, through Jewish history, lived Jewish lives, frankly, not much different than ours. I mean, they kept mitzvot, they came to shul, they prayed to God, they found the meaning of their lives and the religious experience of God in the ordinary structures of Jewish life. They made Shabbos, they came for Yontif, they prayed, they believed in a God who was involved in their world. They believed in a God who listened to their prayers. They believed in a God who spoke to them through the Torah. They observed the Torah, and they were waiting for God's Messiah to redeem them. That's your great-grandparents and my great-grandparents. But on each end of the community, there were two radicals. Just imagine on the outskirts of the community. There was one guy who said, I'm not satisfied with the level of intensity of God intervening in my life. I want something more. I want a deep personal intimacy with God. And that one becomes a mystic. And he follows the path of the mystic. And what the mystic wants is a deep personal intimacy. Don't talk to me about God. Don't assure me that God is listening. I want to meet God. I want to know God, knowing in every sense of the word, really. And that's the mystic, okay? And he or she goes on their mystic journey, usually through meditation and trances, and comes back to describe it and has to use a very strange language to describe it. And that's the mystical text we have, like Shir Koma. And then on the other side of town is the rationalist, who says, I believe that God is a great mind, and that everything that God does and is in the world reveals deep wisdom. And I want to know that wisdom. So I want to understand why I do the things religiously I do, and how God created the world that's in front of me. Now you can see where these two sort of come really close to each other, because they're both rejecting the normal path of religion and setting out on their own path. And they both really want, in some ways, the same thing, a more personal knowledge, understanding, and intimacy, touching the great power of God. But while one of it does through the imagination of mysticism, the other does it through the power of rationalism. So now the question I want to ask you, and we won't stop because we're going to have coffee first, right? It's just much more holy, which is, first of all, how does a community tolerate these crazy guys on each side? How do you find room for these guys in the community? How do you allow them to go off on their journeys? What happens if their journeys undermine the normal route of Jewish life? That's the burning of Maimonides, right? And what did we learn as a community? How did their insights come to affect our own Judaism? And we're going to come back in a moment and show you that mysticism and rationalism found a place in the normal conduct of Jewish life, but in some of the most unexpected places you would ever imagine. Give you one little hint. There's a prayer that's said early on Shabbos morning that is so erotic, if you understood it, you would blush. And it's recited by the youngest child in the synagogue early in the morning in a squeaky little voice. And thank God he or she doesn't understand what the hell they're reading.
Yeah. It's a good one. Yeah, right. Go to the roots.
Hi. Hey, where are you in your life? You're in Minnesota or someplace. Ohio. Where? Oberlin? How is it?
Tomorrow you'll see me very happy to see you. By tomorrow 7:30.
Thank you.
Perfect for you. Having fun? Is it great? What are you learning?
Well, I took philosophy class. I took a class with
Who was it? Good? Wow.
And then I took a class on Florence, Vienna, and then I took a drawing class.
What was the Shir Koma? When was that relative to what's the age? What's the time?
Nobody knows, but it could be. It's a lot earlier. It's probably like 400 years earlier, or even earlier than that. We're not sure.
talk about how many angels could dance on a
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I missed that one. I know.
As they say in the church, that's Mishigas.
Michigan, that's right. All right, thank you.
Just lovely. Oh, that's wonderful.
Expecting a grandchild.
Yay!
After you, young man.
Thank you, thank you. It's been a while since I've been called a young man. It's good.
Look, when I was in chemistry, we didn't even know about DNA.
Oh,
We're talking about DNA.
thank you, Vincent. When was DNA discovered? In the early 60s?
I was out of high school by then.
Yeah. Here, I'll go, please. Please.
I'm sorry.
Please, please. Is the same cookie?
I thought Rugula was the manifestation of God. That proved that there was a God.
I agree. I love a good rugula.
I was delayed and I missed the introduction, but I gather you're a professor at HUC downtown?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Because my grandson was just admitted to USC.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. Good to have him.
Mom is Kazanita Hazan Cantor.
Yeah.
And he went to Jewish school or she took part in the Maimonides Scholars Program this summer at Yale.
Where really?
Yeah.
Where was she ordained as a cantor?
HUC.
Oh, really? When?
New York. Well, she's celebrating her 25th year. She's her first position. Yeah, she's getting an honorary.
She's getting an honorary doctorate.
Yeah.
Very soon. Probably
May, I
this.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In New York. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Going to be at USC now. There's.
This is their son. If he gets accepted to Columbia,
I bet. Good. Well, of course. USC, he should find us, and then we'll recruit him.
I'm gonna.
Don't let me stand. Don't let me stand between a man and his cookies. I'll tell you.
this is the best.
I could eat these all day. It's,
Yeah, that's so good.
that's the problem. They're too good. They're not. They're so. Yeah, you have to be careful.
That's the problem.
There's no solution.
You can confuse yourself.
That's right. Enjoy your life. I like it.
Excuse me.
It's February 4th.
You're talking about this room. I moved here in January of 1981. You were a kid. From Ohio. Had no idea what shul I'm going to join. I'm from 3 shuls in Akron.
Excuse me. Of course. I'm sorry.
And I come to this huge city with, never thought I would join a big congregation. My father died 6 months after I had moved here. When I came back from sitting Shiva, there was nobody. I had no family, I had no friends. Yeah. This minion surrounded me, and women were in the minyan here.
Were they?
My sister in Akron, she and I were the only ones saying Kaddish. My sister was the first woman to be in the minyan there. And they said, the last day of Shiva, they said, come sit here. This is where your father always sat. So when when he died, and when I came back, and I started coming to the minyan, Mr. Groom was here in this. I joined VBS that summer.
Thank you for that story.
It's my community.
Yeah, that's what it should
to
be.
To me, there is nothing like VBS.
Yeah, well.
So when I said, please come back,
yeah.
I sincerely.
Thank you.
And the two of you are good together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the story.
He liked to use adverbs. You act godly. Yeah. So, but for sure, you have to know that Maimonides is right. Yeah. Maimonides approaches action and ends. And what's fun is he gets mad. He gets mad at himself. And he has all sorts of choice words. Ignorant, fools, idiots, lunkheads, you know. I know what they are in Arabic.
Like, what was his name? Schwartzberg, or whoever was speaking about
Yeah, I know. But I just told him the story about how I came to
Oh, really?
My mother's my father had died 6 months after I had no friends.
Why do you think Maimonides was the opposite of the other one rather than trying to explain it?
For one thing, we're not in the minyan.
It sounded to me like he was more of a synthesizer, like the second one.
He is sometimes understood as a synthesizer, but he's not a synthesizer with. He's a synthesizer. He attempts to harmonize.
That one sounded like that particular example.
He's attempting to harmonize Torah with rationalism, but not rationalism with mysticism. He rejects mysticism completely as far too literal, because the mystic is saying not only does God literally have a throne and a court, but God has a body, and
But what I'm saying is, I don't know who this rabbi was that you're attributing the first one to.
we don't know. Oh yeah, Rabbi Ishmael.
Yeah, whatever. But if he was not really trying to say that, I mean, was he a well-known mystic, or they don't know who he was?
No, they're attributing the mystical attitude to a real rabbi, Rabbi Ishmael. I don't think I would call him.
What if this rabbi actually was doing it as
A metaphor?
A metaphor.
It's possible. But he wasn't necessarily being received that way. People who read him as saying, this is how we understand God experientially. Yeah.
Because when I read it without knowing anything, it sounded to me more like Maimonides was trying to make sense out of it in a way that he believed.
He was trying to make
a
sense.
And that it was not that the other guy was not being understood properly.
Yeah, that's a possibility that the other guy was not being understood properly, but the way he was being interpreted by the medieval Jews was
that it was literal.
Yeah, at least some of the time. So they're opposite. They have Torah in the middle, the mystical interpretation of Torah, and then the rational interpretation, but they don't meet mystical and rational.
They don't meet,
Yeah,
but
they both meet Torah.
thing.
They meet Torah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, take your seats.
Well, I want to thank Professor Holo for leading us in this conversation so far. I want to make one observation, and then we have lots of questions. I'll give you the answer to my thing before. This is what he's describing for us, as you can see from the sources. Sadya Gaon is 9th century. Sefer Yetzirah is a little bit before that. Shir Koma is 14th, 15th century. Maimonides is 11th century. These are medieval sources. These are pre-modern sources. But the conversation that he's engaged us in, this conversation between a rational approach to Judaism, a mystical approach to Judaism, and what I called before, sort of the popular and sort of normative approach to Judaism. This conversation never ends. It goes on all the time, right? Because there are rationalists among us who want to know how this is intelligible and what its wisdom is. And there are mystics among us who are seeking personal experiences of things that are beyond the norm, beyond normal experiences. And then there's the rest of us who are trying to just live Jewish lives. And this goes on even very much now. It's very, very common even now. So let's begin with a question, and then I want to engage you in lots of questions. So, Professor, how is it that if a mystic comes along and says, I don't want to abide by the standards of the community, I want my own knowledge of God, and the rationalist comes by and says, you're all a bunch of fools, you're not asking the right questions about religious life, how is there room in the community for these kind of, they're rebels. How is there room in the community for the rebels? In Christian circles and in Muslim circles, mystics got burned at the stake, and rationalists were thrown out as heretics. But we Jews, we don't do that. Well, we throw a few of them out.
It depends.
Depends
on the rationalists.
That's true. We don't do that too often. We find ways of, how do you engage this kind of religious radicalism in a normative community?
The way in history that we have done this is multiple ways. I'll name a few.
Please.
One is that the rebel has sometimes breached the norms of Jewish living. In this case, let's say Jacob Frank or Shabbatai Tzvi, later mystics, who did expressly say that they were a perfect example of the danger you cited, which was they looked their fellow Jews in the eyes and they said, I know better. I know better not just than you, I know better than your rabbi. In fact, I know better not only than the rabbi, I know better than the halacha itself. And I'm going to do as I very well please. And they did in one way or another. We won't go into the details.
Oh, come on. Jacob Frank, in the 16th century in Germany, is the only time in recorded Jewish history, I'm not making this up, there were religious orgies.
That's right.
Now, boy, people would come to shul if we did that. I'm telling you. I mean, but because what he said was, I'm the Messiah has come, all the rules are canceled. In fact, not only are the rules canceled, to show that the Messiah has come, we have to purposely break the rules. And when Jews start breaking rules, Kanai Nahara, they can break rules, right?
They go all the way.
There you go.
So there's an overlap between this kind of rebellion and messianism, actively believing that the Messiah has come, which Jews generally are extremely suspicious of, not only because of Jesus, but also because of Jesus. And so these two guys, a century apart, they got kicked out. They did get kicked out because they came to the edge and then they crossed. And in so doing, they did something very important. They reestablished the boundaries. And the Jewish community began to be able to reassert the boundaries because of these egregious examples. That's one way that's controlled. Another way is halacha itself. Mm-hmm. That the rabbis like Maimonides or Moses de Leon, the author of the Zohar in the 13th century, They knew perfectly well that they were dallying with the boundary of propriety, of religious living, of communal standards, and they actively bent over backwards to make sure that they did not breach them. And so they lived their lives and they protested their allegiance to the community, to traditional halakha, and they engaged, as we know they did, they engaged in community living in meaningful ways that reassured the community that they were maybe pushing the envelopes, but they chose not to be rebels. Now, they were suspected of rebellion, but that was it. They were not really, in fact, heretics or rebels, or if they were heretics, they kept it to themselves. And there is a debate today, the degree to which Maimonides, for example, was a heretic, because of everything you've outlined. But we don't know that for a fact, and we know that he led a life that was designed to deny that accusation.
Right. So just to point that, the implication of this is very important. What the professor is saying is, you can come to shul, and you can be davening in shul, and there are people praying next to you, or you go to the kosher butcher shop, and there are people buying kosher food next to you, right? And you don't know if they are mystics, rationalists, or normative Jews, because they're all acting out the same religious behaviors. What you don't know is what's inside of them. The mystic is doing it because he or she sees that as a mystic act of repairing the universe. Okay? The rationalist does it because he understands that he's communing with the wisdom of God and how God put the universe together. And the normative Jew is doing it because his rabbi told him that's what he needs to be doing. And you don't know any of that because outwardly they look just like the rest of us. But inside, and that's the difference between Judaism and Christianity, one of the differences, in the sense that we typically don't burn heretics at the stake as long as they live Jewish lives.
That's right. I couldn't agree more, and I would like to bring a finer point to it by using an example today. Raise your hand if you know somebody, not yourself, if you know somebody who is an affirmative atheist but goes to shul. Yeah? I mean, surely we know people who affirm the absence of God, who aren't, but who still show up to shul.
Make seders, come to Purim, put on costumes on Purim.
Right, and
build a sukkah.
That's standard in American Judaism today, and yet none of us would ever think twice about not inviting them to shul or not inviting them to our home for Shabbos.
So it's an important thing to remember that we had the communal structure which was flexible and resilient enough to invite even very radical expressions of Jewish theology, Jewish belief, but kept a core of community solidarity through the way that we lived lives. And so you have one of the most interesting phenomena you have is that some of the most wild mystics ended up at the same time as some of the most normative leaders. Let me give you the best example. The Code of Jewish Law, which is the code that is used by every rabbi in the world right now. It is the operant code of Jewish law. It's called the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, put together by a famous rabbi named Yosef Karo in Eretz Yisrael in 1550. Yosef Karo by day was the greatest Jewish lawyer who ever lived. And by night, an angel would come and take him by the hand and lead him up through the heavens to meet angels and demons and God and see God's throne. And he writes in his journals about these mystical journeys that he took. So by night, he's this psychedelic Jewish heaven traveler. And by day, he's the most powerful Jewish lawyer in the world. So by night, he writes these journals about his mystical journeys. And by day, he writes the code of Jewish law that all of us observe. Only Jews could get away with a mishigas like this.
In a single person. He's not alone. Who's ever heard of the Vilna Gaon?
Right?
The Vilna Gaon was the warrior for rationalism against the Hasidim who were developing their personalized, radical mysticism. and yet he was one of the most important commentators on the Zohar, and he would study with his feet in a cold bath of ice water to induce mystical experience and to focus the mind. This is within the realm of the Jewish experience.
Oh, and so I told you before. So one of the ways that we did this, the other way that we kept the community together, one is by using halakha as a Jewish life, as a solidarity. The other way was we co-opted the mystics. We borrowed from the mystics, right? So some of the things you know. For example, you all know that at the beginning of Friday night services, there's a set of psalms and a couple of hymns called Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat was invented in the 17th century by a group of mystic Jews, 16th, 17th century, mystic Jews who lived in Tzfat in the north of Israel, most of whom were refugees from Spain, and they were mystics. And the whole idea was that they imagined Shabbat as a queen coming in among them, and that Friday night was the great wedding. Because in their mystical idea, God was broken. And the male half of God, God's power, and the female half of God, God's love, were separated, and that's why the world is so broken. But on Friday night, the two come back into proximity with each other, and we, the Jewish community, have to be the shadchan, the matchmaker, to bring them back together. So they sang these erotic love songs, but they put them into religious poetry. And so now in shul you sing, Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat Lecha Bila, which means, come, let us greet the Shabbat bride. And it's all about bringing the bride and the groom together. Now it gets a little racy. You have to be over 18, right, to come together and to be intimate, because if we can marry God's power with God's love, once again, the world might be redeemed, right? Shabbos morning, we sing a song. It's sang at the very end of services in very Orthodox synagogues. We often sing it at the very beginning of services, called Anim Zmirot. You know this song? Yeah. It's a 12th century, Anim Zmiros, B'shirim Erog. It's a 10th, 11th, 12th century, somewhere in there, song from the Merkava mystics, right? And if you read the words, whoo! Very racy. Anim Zmirot, B'shirim Erog, Ki Elecha Nafshi Ta'arog. I will weave my songs and present them to you, because for you, God, my soul, and the word ta'arog can only mean extraordinarily powerful sexual desire. So what do? You get a 3-year-old to sing this. Come to an Orthodox shul, it's this little teeny pitzkala who they put on an apple crate. Why? Because it's this, you've co-opted, you've taken the mystical language and made it normative and brought it into the synagogue, and you make it kosher in that way. But really, it's underneath it, it's this very powerful, intimate, erotic, mystical kinds of, because the eroticism is a metaphor for the mystic's yearning to be close to God. You see how that works? So this is what makes this so very interesting, is that this became part of the fabric of Jewish life. Right. You had a question a moment ago.
My question is that somehow a derivative way of your question. If Mashiach is coming today,
yes,
what would be criteria to accept him as a Mashiach? There would be 3 alternatives.
So the question is, if the Messiah were to arrive today, how would we know? And how you would know that was the true Messiah as opposed to a false Messiah? Professor?
There are the first thing I need to say is that the burden of proof is on the Messiah. And the rabbis teach us that if you're doing something useful, like planting a tree, and somebody says, the Messiah is coming, you say, okay, hold on, I'm planting a tree. Because we know that planting a tree has intrinsic value. It's all of our business to plant trees. But the Messiah is a questionable proposition. Moreover, the great philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovich in Israel used to describe the Messiah as always coming, but never arriving. Do you all remember reading Rudyard Kipling and the beautiful illustrations, which, by the way, in the first editions, Rudyard Kipling himself drew, just so you know. And there are these scenes where the boy is on the elephant's back and holding the carrot at the end of the stick, and leading the elephant with the carrot at the end of the stick. That's where we get the phrase "the carrot and the stick," because you can whack it with the stick. The idea, of course, is that the elephant will follow the carrot, but he's never going to get closer to the carrot. The carrot can guide him in the right direction, but he will never actually get there. And so the idea is that the Messiah should be a carrot at the end of the stick, so that we should always be yearning for it and going in that direction, but it may never arrive. Now, this is just one philosopher's point of view, but here's what I want to say. I want to say that there's a very heavy burden to prove that anyone is the Messiah, no matter what the criteria are, and I'm sure that between the two of us, we'll do a pretty good job of canvassing the criteria. Moreover, because of the career of Jesus, and because of the career of the two false messiahs that we cited earlier, among other lesser-known false messiahs, and because there are cases of real, live Jewish communities packing up their bags, giving up their lives, and making a false start to return to the land of Israel, and subjecting themselves to danger and ridicule and pain and suffering and monetary loss. This actually happened a few times in the course of our history. The first and foremost position with respect to the criteria, who is and who is not the Messiah, is the assumption that this person is not the Messiah. That's number one. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the actual criteria that you ask. There are some standard ones. Some are more political, some are more sociological, and some are more spiritual. Some say that all war will end. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev. There will be no more war. The lamb will lie down with the lion. We will beat our swords into plowshares, and we will raise the very status of the human experience a notch closer to godliness, and our life on earth will reflect that. More spiritualized even than that, the resurrection of the dead. A huge issue of contention for Maimonides and his contemporaries. Will they literally rise, or will they spiritually rise and reunite with the Creator? Those are some spiritual ones. Political ones. The reestablishment of the sovereignty of the Jewish people in their tradition. Sound familiar? That's why so many Haredi movements in 1948 refused to recognize the State of Israel, because it was hastening the Messiah improperly, because one of the criteria for the arrival of the Messiah is the quote-unquote ingathering of all of the Jews around the world to return to our homeland, the umbilical return to our womb. That's another criterion. King David's return, a political version, is also one of the criteria. And if some combination of these things happen, and by consensus, the Jewish people determine that the Messiah has come, presumably that will be the determining result. But there are other criteria as well from the course of our tradition. And before I hand it off to the rabbi, who will no doubt add many dimensions to this, I want to point out that one of the medieval debates that we didn't talk about was the degree to which belief in the Messiah is necessary for full Jewish belief in the first place. Right. It wasn't clear that you had to believe in the Messiah to be a fully enfranchised Jew. So there are very, very many variables. I would say that the tradition is A, putting a heavy burden on anyone who would claim to be Messiah, and B, very vague in a way which I think is generally kind of on purpose.
Yeah. So the great scholar Gershon Scholem, who was the really father of the study of Jewish mysticism, distinguishes between two kinds of messianic beliefs. And he doesn't use mysticism and rationalism as the divide. He calls them apocalyptic and anti-apocalyptic. So apocalyptic Messiah, apocalypse means Big Bang. See, there were those who believed that the Messiah would come and everything changed. Everything changed. This is the belief that was available that was powerful on the eve of Shabtai Tzvi's sort of false Messiah, because people really believed this guy was going to come to the world and everything was going to change. He would become king over all the world, and the Jews would be free, and the dead would rise, and natural law would change. This apocalyptic, this belief that the world is so corrupt that it'll take the Messiah to redo it, recreate the whole world. And then there was an opposite belief, which is Maimonides was the great, who said, even if the Messiah comes, nothing much is going to change. Lower expectations, tempt down. You could see where the anti-apocalyptics, mostly the rationalists, were afraid that the more you dreamed about, the more disappointed you'd become if it didn't happen. I mean, we've often had these experiences where people expected crazy things to happen. You know, Martians are going to come down and take the whole cult up into the sky. And when it doesn't happen, it's really interesting, you know, how they explain why it didn't happen. But when those things happen and you expect it to happen and it doesn't, it leaves you disillusioned. And the anti-apocalyptics were worried. So they tried to say, Maimonides in his code says, you know, even if Messiah comes, the laws of nature will not change. Lions are not going to lie down with lambs. Woody Allen used to say, the lamb may lie down with the lion, but the lamb ain't going to get a lot of sleep. You know, yeah. Lions aren't going to lie down with lambs. You know, the laws of nature are not going to change. There's one thing, he said. The one thing he says is Jews will live freely in their own land and observe a life of mitzvot without being interfered with. Right? Which is why the early Zionists saw themselves as in the tradition of that messianic tradition. But really, there's a long tradition trying to push down the idea of Messiah, because it's a scary idea. It's a very powerful idea. Okay? So that's another way to think about it, another way to separate between schools of thought in the Jewish Middle Ages. We've got time for one more question. Yeah, please.
Thinking about your discussion of trying to harmonize the 2 points of view.
Yes, please.
I had a thought that I want to see if you think it has any merit.
Yeah.
The early Jewish Christians, did they see in Jesus a harmonizing in the sense that they saw God physicality and yet the ultimate in spirituality?
So the question is the early, I'm repeating it for the microphone. Did early Christianity, is that a species of this kind of harmonizing between mysticism and sort of rationalism, because you're taking in the incarnate God and still trying to incorporate that into into normative Judaism?
There are at least 2 stages to answer that question. In the early Christian stages, meaning during the lifetime of Jesus himself, the answer is no, because we think that they didn't attribute to Jesus divinity in the first place. However, even those early Christians did, it appears, attribute to Jesus some messianic associations and or indeed being the Messiah, maybe. And as such, if we understand the early Christians as imbuing Jesus with messianic meaning but not divine meaning, then we revert to the image that the rabbi laid out about the challenge of messianism in Judaism, even though messianism is a Jewish idea. And so there the challenge is not so much, it is mystical in the sense that messianism is almost always has mystical components, but it's not harmonized with rationalism, because they're not worried about rationalism as a major category in that stage of our development. There were influences of Greek philosophy, no question, but and we have a couple examples like Acher, and we have a couple personalities, but we don't think of it as having the kind of grand sociological power that it had during the Middle Ages. Maybe during the days of Hanukkah, 150 years before that, maybe. But even then, it doesn't appear to be philosophical necessarily so much. We don't know. There were, of course, Philos, and there were these people. But I would say the experience of Jesus is more a ramping up of the messianic dream than some kind of harmonization between rationalism and mysticism. And then when you get into the divinity part, I think, again, other things are at play, and that's a good few generations away.
Greg, you have a quick question because we're going to.
They were really influenced by the Essenics, the Quran. It was after, it was Constantinian that they came in with an idea of Jesus' divinity.
Yeah.
It was after Paul and before Constantine. Constantine resolved the problem, but the problem of Jesus' divinity had been percolating for 200 years.
Want to thank Professor Holo for being with us tonight. Welcome back to VBS.
Thank you.
Next week we're going to continue with mystics and non-mystics, Hasidim and Misnagdim, right? So please come back and enjoy. I think we may be back in this room or the other room. I'll tell you when you get here. Have a lovely week. Take good care. And whichever team you're rooting for on Sunday, say Shechianu, right? Thank you so much.